Welcome back to our midweek Bible study. And before we leave the Sermon on the Mount, we want to come back to that concept we ended with last week. Right after the wise man built his house upon the rock, and then the foolish man built his house upon the sand, we talked about checking your foundation, making sure your foundation was solid. Paul would later say, no other foundation can any man lay than that which has been laid, Jesus the Christ. And here, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. The reason he taught that way was because Jesus has the authority. At the end of Matthew, Jesus is going to look at them and say, all power, all authority has been given unto me. We need to remember that. He doesn't say has been given to what other people say about me, or about what preachers say about me, or about what church doctrinal statements say about me. It's been given to Jesus. That's the foundation. Everything else is uncertain at best. So again, check your foundation. And now we leap out of the sermon into the stories of Jesus' life as he goes through healing, teaching, and the like. And we start with a really, really good story here in Matthew chapter 8. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Other tellings of this story have Jesus responding, if I'm willing. It's funny, and Jesus was funny. He'd said things that were funny, but we don't get it because the Semitic humor is very different than broad American humor, which itself is very different from British humor and the like. So we don't get it. Humor in Semitic places isn't like a Pharisee, a Sadducee, and a Essene walked into a bar. It is far more subtle, and it uses wordplay. But here, Matthew leaves that part out. What is also left out didn't need to be put in for them, but might be for us. And that is a leper. A leper knelt in front of them. Okay, a word about leprosy. Today, when we talk about leprosy, we're talking about Hansen's disease. Hansen's disease is not very communicable. It's not easily transferred from one person to the other. And it is eminently treatable. It was, back then, not Hansen's disease only, but all kinds of skin diseases that deteriorated the skin or killed the nerve endings in the body were called leprosy. Now, let me explain. Leprosy is primarily not a skin disease. It is primarily a disease of the nerves. The nerves deaden, and therefore you cannot feel. And therefore injuries occur, infections, cuts, and you don't feel it, and therefore necrosis sets in, tissue dies, fingers fall off, noses fall off. We've heard the horror stories, which are true. And it happens because you can't feel anything, and then the body doesn't supply enough nutrients, enough blood flow to keep the tissue alive. It's a horrific way to go. And because there was no treatment for it, it was very, very ingrained in God's law, first 5 books of the Bible, that a leper was to stay away from the community because some of these diseases are easily communicable. And that, in fact, if somebody got close, they were to ring a bell and yell out, unclean, to warn you. That'd be a hard life. But one thing a leper was never allowed to do was to come into proximity on purpose with those that did not have leprosy. And here he does. He falls down at his feet, kneels before him, calls him Lord. Does that mean he believed that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God? Nope. It's another way of saying, sir, you are higher than me. You have greater status than I do. You're obviously a very important person. He didn't call him rabbi, but he pretty much the same kind of deference, an honorific to him. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. He must have heard something about Jesus. He must have known something about this fella that's going through teaching and healing people. Jesus does something here totally unnecessary. Now, we've already gone through the book of Mark, so you already know that Jesus can heal at a distance without not even seeing the person. He can heal them. Well, then, what's he doing here when he reaches out and touches the man? Wow. Well, several things are happening here. Number one, you're not allowed to touch a leper's not allowed to touch you. Jesus touches the leper. Number two, when you touch a leper, you are ceremonially unclean according to Old Testament law, and you're not allowed to be around other people to teach them or the like. Jesus is going to ignore that as well. Third, why touch him? Well, I used to be a shrink. And when I read things like this, I smile, and it makes me like Jesus even more, because nobody had touched that leper for a long time. And being touched, we need to be touched. In the Detroit area, a town called Rochester, I worked for about 10 years. Lovely, lovely time of life. Really enjoyed that time of life. And on Sunday, we had 3 services, back to back to back. And that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. I would love to do that again. You can replicate that by listening to them 3 times in a row if you want to. The third service was very few rules. We called it Mosaic because it was bit of everything. And for communion, we didn't pass communion trays. There was not one central place, but rather we had tables set apart. And people would come to the tables, and they would take with each other. One lady came, and she pulled me aside later, and she'd come for many weeks to the third service. She goes, I like the other services better. And I just nodded. I didn't say why, because you're allowed to like what you like. She said, but because I'm pretty conservative, and that first service is I'm more comfortable there. And I said, okay. And then she said, but I come to this one because this is the only place and the only time all week I'm going to get a hug. Because you see, when people came up to the tables to take, they very often hugged each other in greeting. And she got a hug. This was a divorced woman who had a very bad marriage, and divorce is probably the right answer, in my opinion, 100%, but I don't know everything. She was a wonderful woman, a wonderful daughter of God, and I had not considered that she wouldn't be touched, except for this. I recently watched police training videos because I'm involved in training law enforcement. And from a uniform cam of a police officer, patrol officer, pulls over a man who is saying he's going to commit suicide. The man's a vet. He has PTSD. He's struggling. Police officer handled it perfectly. Talking to him, working with him, got him out of the car. When the man came around, he goes, you don't have anything on you that could hurt me. The guy goes, no, I don't. And he's sobbing and the police officer said, do you mind if I check? You have to. You can never take people's word. So he checks. The man's clean. There's no weapon on him. And then he says to the man, do you mind if I give you a hug? And I about lost it. Because that's not something you expect to hear from a police officer who's pulled you over. And the man weeps because he is being touched. Jesus didn't have to touch the leper. All the rules would have said, don't touch the leper. But get it in your head, because this is the message of Christ that permeates Scripture if you know where to look. Love trumps law. When in doubt, love. If love breaks some rules, you may have to do it. Now, that doesn't mean Like, I'm going to break some rules and hurt my wife and hurt my kids and hurt everybody else. And no, no, no. That's not love. You're leaving wreckage in your wake. Love means love. And if love means you're going to overlook this, the Bible talks about love covers a multitude of sins. When in doubt, love. He touches him. Immediately, he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go tell the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. What's going on there? If you no longer had active skin disease, you'd looked and you're no longer progressive, then you could go to the priest, and the priest, who had a very ritual and rigid, rigorous is the word I want, rigorous cleansing protocol, they were the safest ones to go to, and there were no medical doctors as such. So you'd go to the priest, and they would actually measure and actually sometimes even write on you, where the limits were, and you would do your cleansing and such and come back in a certain amount of time. If it had not progressed, you were to offer up sacrifices, thanks to God, and part of the sacrifice, you didn't burn the whole animal. You burned a part of it. The rest of it went as food for the priest. And so that's what it means as a testimony to them. And you're testifying to them also that God has healed you of this disease. Now, you're still not allowed to go into the temple and some of the things because you're marked. You are disfigured, but you're allowed back in society. And so that was a tremendous blessing for them. And Jesus says, don't tell anybody. Now, other gospels will tell you that when Jesus said, don't tell anybody, most of the time they told people. Now, a couple questions. One, why would he say, don't tell anybody? Well, I think, in my personal opinion, it's to limit the crush of the mob. Because let's face it, friends, if you go out and you set up a stand and you have all diseases cured, you're going to have a mob. And the mob's going to be 24/7. It's never going away. The same thing would happen if you put down free pizza. You're never going to get out of there unless you say we're out of pizza. Jesus has teaching to do. He has people to seek out that he wants to talk to. He's got disciples, apostles that he needs to train. He's got to lay some groundwork, and there's a shadow of a cross coming, and he knows it's coming. He knew it was coming before he entered our planet in Bethlehem that night. He knows it's there. He knows there's a clock ticking. He's got to get some work done. So when Jesus heals people and says, don't talk about it, why'd they talk about it? Really? Really? You can't figure that out? Well, there's several reasons. One is people are going to notice, wait a minute, didn't you used to be blind? Didn't you used to not be able to walk? What's going on here? And by the way, some of that discussion does take place in the gospel. Others, it's just because you've been healed. You have your life. And you just can't help but tell somebody who tells somebody who tells somebody. I think it was Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, who said 2 people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. You just can't keep this stuff to yourself. But it delayed the crowd enough to let Jesus move on. And especially in Mark, you can see Jesus wanting to move on, always looking to move on. And the crowds would have to find him. That allowed him some time. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came up to him asking for help. A centurion. What is a centurion? Well, technically, it would be a non-commissioned officer. Think of a sergeant of any level who was over 100 men. Was he over strictly 100 men? No, those numbers varied. If you've ever been in the military, you know that troop strength is not your actual strength and that those numbers go up and down. But that gives you a general idea. Think of a non-commissioned officer like a sergeant who has a group of about 100 men that he's responsible for. And he's a Roman. Well, who are the Romans? They're the occupiers. They're one of the bad guys of the day. Herod's one of the bad guys. Romans one of the bad guys. Romans are taxing you. They have zero concept of you having any rights at all. So if they want to take your stuff, they take your stuff. If they want to, grab your son and put him, press him is the phrase, press him into service as a Roman soldier, they can do it. You have no recourse, no court that's going to back you up. There are instances as well of them grabbing your daughter as a wife, and there's nothing you can do about it. Supervision over the military was not Christian or morality based. So here's this man coming up to Jesus, who people are looking at as possibly being the Messiah, who's going to reestablish the kingdom of Israel and drive out this guy. So you see the intake of breath. When a centurion marches up to Jesus, you assume Jesus is going to be arrested, struck down, taken in for questioning, which meant torture back then, always meant torture back then. But he comes up and says, "My servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." The word here means a servant. Now, it could be a Roman servant. It could have been a Jewish servant. It could have been from anywhere Rome had sent its armies. But here's a man who's concerned about his servant. And so he goes to somebody who has no reason to help him. Jesus had no reason to help him. And in fact, helping him might very well have caused Jesus some serious issues with some of his followers. Because how dare you help that guy? Now, I would use illustrations and say, what if somebody like this were to come up to you? But here's the problem. Any of them I use will be limited and may not actually be somebody you would think of. And if I say the wrong thing, YouTube pulls this down. So think of the Good Samaritan. Think of, here it was the greatest enemy you had helped you. Let's turn that around. The greatest enemy you've got is in need. How do you respond? How do you respond if you know you're being watched by people who will leave you if you're nice to this person? That's the position Jesus was in. But this man needed help, and he'd asked for help. And Jesus looks at him and goes, "Shall I come and heal him? Is that what you want?" I love it about Jesus that he often stops when people bring up an issue, and he goes, "What would you like me to do? Be specific. What would you like for me to do?" And he goes, "Do you want me to come with you? Go heal him?" And the centurion says something amazing. I love this, and it makes me wonder where he'd gotten some of this information. The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof." Somewhere somebody had taught the centurion something about morality and how some people were more moral than him, that some people were better than him. And this is no false humility. He's gone, I can't ask you to come to my house. No, I can't ask that. But look what he says. "But say the word, and my servant will be healed." What? Where did he get that? Oh, he'll tell you. "For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I'll tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes. And that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." He is looking at Jesus saying, I recognize somebody who has authority. I know what authority is. I know what orders are. I know what it's like to be under orders. I know what it's like to give orders. And you, Jesus, are a person who has the authority to command anything. You don't have to come to my house. You can just say the word. Are you all surprised by this? I'm surprised by this, and I've read this probably well over 1,000 times. I'm still surprised by it, wondering, who is this guy? What did he hear that drove him to this point? When Jesus heard this, he was also surprised. Please remember, Jesus was totally God, totally human. However, there is a progression of his understanding and knowing, some of which was lost when he became a human. He laid aside, in Philippians chapter 2, took upon himself no reputation, lived among us, so he could be surprised, not knowing what was going to happen next. Now, how much did he know and when did he know it? Not a bit of that is revealed to us. We're just going to have to wait until later, and maybe we'll figure that out or we'll be told. But Jesus was amazed, and you don't see him going, and turn around to those following him and saying, you see this? He says, truly I tell you, I've not found anyone in Israel. Who's he talking to? He's just turned around to those following him who are of Israel. And he's saying, I haven't found anybody here that has the faith of this guy. Jesus was not always walking around with a lamb saying sweet things. And here he's really challenging them. He goes, have you guys figured out who I am? He's figured it out. Have you guys figured this out? He goes and says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feet of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In other words, just because you're close to me, don't assume you're one of me. Not unless you're like this guy and you have faith in me. Now, that does lead to an issue, doesn't it? Because have you ever asked for somebody to be healed and they weren't? Me too. Did it ever hurt you? Me too. Did it ever hurt your faith? Me too. Did it ever really mess up your prayer life? Me too. I, however, believe I still stand with the centurion, saying to God, you don't have to travel. I know who you are, and you have the authority to heal. It's just that sometimes I don't know why he does not. He's got that figured out, but I don't. And I have no easy words for you. I will not look at you and say, well, God has a plan. I know God has a plan, but that doesn't mean we can't be frustrated. But I still believe in him. And this centurion believed in him. Jesus is challenging those. Don't get too comfortable. Only those who come and have that faith in me get to be this kingdom of heaven, get to be part of the force that I'm building. Jesus said to the centurion, go on. Let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. Well, see, now that's later information that had to come back through to Matthew. That would have taken some time to learn, but it's a great ending for the story. I had a couple of friends, dear friends, in the Knoxville, Tennessee area. And I used to go speak at that church quite frequently, and they had a couple of parrots. And the parrots were of the super intelligent kind of parrots, the African and Congo parrots that, the African gray, Congo gray, that even Cornell University has been studying for decades because of their abilities to understand language. And one of them was just famous for having picked up a Southern lingo with all of it as well. That if you said goodbye, and everybody's saying goodbye, they would say goodbye too. But if then you lingered for a while and you kept talking, the bird would go, well, go on. And it was kind of freaky, but hilarious at the same time. Jesus isn't here quite going, go on. He's just saying, all right, on your way. Let it be done just as you believed it would. Before he came, the centurion had faith in Jesus. Jesus is going, okay, then it's taken care of. it's a great story. You got to love that story. But that's not the only one. Jesus has been healing many, and he continues. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. Now, fevers are your body's way of killing the infection, because most bacteria and most viruses cannot take an elevated temperature. So when your body gets those in there to a certain amount that they're able to overwhelm your immune system for a while, your immune system fights back in many ways. And one of the ways is to turn up the temperature, to slow them down. Sometimes it kills them. Sometimes it kills their ability to replicate. Each of them, it's a little bit different, but fevers are great until fevers go too high. Babies' fevers can go up really fast, really high, and scare us to pieces. If you're a parent or grandparent, it just scares you to pieces. And sometimes you might be talking to the doctor and going, wait, it's not 98.6, which is the Fahrenheit normal, which is usually used in the U.S. No, it's, they're running 101, 101.2. And the doctor's going, it's okay. We don't give them any medicine here. But just watch it. If it gets over 102, or do not take this as medical advice for your kid. Talk to your doctor. But if it gets over this number, then we're going to give them some Tylenol to bring it down. You might be saying, well, why don't we bring it down now? Because the fever's doing good. We can do that sort of thing because we have medicine to stop it if it gets out of control. In Jesus' day, a fever was a very broadly used term for infection. And yes, temperature was usually involved, but infection that was ravaging the body. And they had no antibiotics, didn't even have sulfur drugs. Most herbs are completely useless once a fever strikes. Absolutely useless. Many herbs are actually very harmful after that point. Sorry to be the one to break it to you, but that's the reason why they're not prescribed. It's not because there's no money to be made off of them. There are a whole lot of generic things out there that you can get 90 days worth for $10. They're not afraid of that. It is that, no, it just doesn't work, and there are some side effects. You can do some things like the cold baths, but they couldn't do that. Where are they going to get cold water? They're in a hot climate most of the year. They can snow in Israel, but most of the year. Where are they going to be able to submerge a person in cold water enough to bring down a fever? You see the point. They didn't have anything to really treat except time. That was it. Jesus touched her hand yesterday. About a month ago, by the time you listen to this, I was at a FedEx store and handing my ID over that you have to do, and handing the package back and forth. And the guy, halfway through the transaction, goes, sorry about my voice, I've got a cold. And I'm going, well, that was nice to know, I guess. But here we are touching, handing things back and forth. Most of us know it's probably not a good idea to do a lot of touching and then touching your face. Jesus immediately touches, and the fever left her. She got up and began to wait on him. I've had people say, look at that, he only healed her so she would serve him. No, she was getting back to doing what she liked to do. I've met a lot of ladies whose love language is caring for others, or their love language is cooking, and they won't let you get out of the house until they've cooked for you. And then they're going to keep bringing food to you. And then when you're leaving, they start stacking Tupperware in your hands full of food. And you're going, I can never eat all of this. This will become a biology experiment before I can get to it. That's the way they love. And immediately she showed her thankfulness by getting back to doing her love language, waiting on others. By the way, I've met some men whose love language is cooking and caring as well. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. I want you to notice two different things are going on here. They are not thinking or saying in this passage that all sickness is caused by demons. It's split into two. drove out the demons, and healed the sick. It was understood to be a different thing. We're not going to veer off here into a study of demonology and talk about all of that sort of thing. Perhaps we need to do a series on Monday mornings about that eventually. But for now, just be aware that especially in Luke, being possessed by a demon was a separate category from other illnesses. Even epilepsy was mentioned as separate. So they weren't ignorant. Something was going on. I've heard some theologians that will say demons kind of blossom during this time because Jesus was there, and where there's great good, great evil will grow to oppose it. I'm not sure that's the answer, but hey, it could be. To me, it sounds a little bit too dualistic. In other words, that evil and good are at somewhere equal terms. Whereas in Scripture, I do believe that God's good is always overwhelmingly larger and more powerful than evil. So, some reason demons were afoot. If you believe that you have demons in your life, I would suggest that you talk to somebody, that you find a Christian counselor, and that if necessary, you get on some medication. Those people who do not like medication, I understand. And medication for any mental illness or mental dis-ease is very difficult to get right. And so I understand if you've tried 3 or 4 and they've left you like a zombie, or they wired you, or I get that as well. It is a very imprecise science. But don't handle this on your own, and don't just assume it's a demon. There are other possibilities. You might just be sick, and there might be a way to treat that. So that's my ex-shrink, now neuroscience lecture of the day. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. He cared, and he took them away. You might say, why didn't he take mine away then? I would submit to you that probably he's taken most of them away, and we just forget about those. God help me get over the flu. God help me get over pneumonia. God help me get past this. And he does, and he does, and he does. Then we get something that he doesn't take away, and we wonder, why doesn't he take away our diseases? Well, he has taken away a lot, but for some reason, not this one. Maybe it's because this world is not our home and we're just passing through. My bones tell me one thing, but when I get up, I'm still a soldier under orders. And my God tells me, get up and go to work. Get out there, do the job. Sometimes the bones are still going to hurt. And by the way, that's an expression. My bones are pretty good. Jesus saw the crowd around him, and he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Introverts, please know that Jesus gets you. He really gets you. He saw the crowd, and he goes, let's get across the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. All right, Jesus doesn't have a whole lot of time to work on this because he's trying to get in a boat and cross the lake before the crowd gets there. So he just says, really? Foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. You follow me? You really ready to live like this? Another man says, Lord, let me go first and bury my father. But Jesus told him, follow me and let the dead bury the dead. Now, that sounds mean. Yeah, it does. But first of all, understand that the phrase bury my father generally didn't mean that your dad was dead. It meant I'm going to follow you as soon as my dad dies and I'm no longer under his authority. Then I'm going to put my affairs in order, then I'll come join you. And Jesus is saying, we don't have that kind of time. See, Jesus knows the cross is coming. Dad takes a couple years to die. No. He's saying, if you want to follow me, do it now. Whatever's holding you back from following Jesus, do it now. Whatever's keeping you from being baptized, get it done now. Whatever's holding you back from being a member of our safe harbor or being a member of a local community, do it now. It's not like hesitation is a spiritual gift. God calls us to just go ahead. If you have any questions or need help doing any of those, send that in to info@oursafeharbor.com, and we'll pick this up in a pretty cool, dramatic story next week. God bless you.